a chapter on rest and renewal. Three personal journeys revealing the healing power of rest. Caroline's gentle pause. Caroline was 38, with an easy laugh and a tendency to keep her emotions tucked just beneath the surface. She lived in a cozy apartment near the ocean, where the salt-tinged wind often helped her breathe a little deeper. Caroline had wrestled with the echoes of a troubled past, growing up in a fractured home where substances were passed around more freely than love. It wasn't until her late 20s that she embraced a path of recovery, determined not to carry on the cycle. In her new life, Caroline worked as a freelance graphic designer. The job allowed her to set her own hours and escape the pressure of a rigid corporate environment. Yet she found herself saying yes to every project, every commission, until her schedule was teetering on the edge of chaos. The busier she was, the less she had to confront her lingering insecurities. One night, after finishing a project at 3 a.m., Caroline noticed her reflection in the darkened screen of her laptop. Tired eyes, slumped shoulders, and a quiet plea etched across her face. She remembered what her counselor had once told her. Peace doesn't arrive when you finish everything. It appears when you allow yourself the grace to stop. That weekend, Caroline made a promise. She would rest. No phone, no emails, no deadlines. She packed a small overnight bag and checked into a quaint bed and breakfast just a short drive up the coast. The room overlooked a shoreline peppered with driftwood, and she could hear the ocean's steady rhythm every time she cracked the window. At first, her mind raced with questions. Was she being irresponsible? What if clients needed her? But over time, the gentle lull of the waves gave her permission to simply be. She walked barefoot in the sand and collected shells, letting the damp air cling to her skin. She lingered in the breakfast nook each morning, savoring warm tea and fresh scones, feeling the knots in her stomach begin to untangle. By the second day, Caroline felt a slow release of tension that she hadn't realized she was holding. She slept through the night without jolting awake to mental to-do lists. The quiet hush of rest wrapped around her like a soft blanket, reminding her how desperately her body and mind had craved this pause. When she returned home, Caroline noticed she approached her work differently. She set boundaries around her availability and built small pockets of rest into her day, a walk along the beach at lunchtime, a quick meditation before bedtime. In giving herself permission to rest, she stumbled upon the solace and self-compassion that had eluded her for so long. Layla's familiar patterns. Layla was 43, a single mother balancing a small baking business. She ran from her home kitchen. She was known in her neighborhood for her melt-in-your-mouth pastries and specialty cakes. After turning her life around from a tumultuous relationship with prescription medications, Layla had focused her energy on creating a stable environment for her son. Part of her recovery was learning to set boundaries, especially around work. In the early days of her baking enterprise, Layla took on every order she could, hoping to prove her worth. The kitchen became her safe haven, the soothing aroma of vanilla and fresh bread a reminder that life could be sweet. Over time, she learned that she risked burning out if she didn't pace herself. She set strict hours, capped her weekly orders, and ensured she spent quality time with her boy. But recently, after a glowing online review propelled her business into the local spotlight, the demand for her cakes skyrocketed. The temptation to slip back into her old workaholic tendencies became overwhelming. Each time a new order came in, she felt a rush of excitement mingled with fear. If I don't say yes, will I lose this momentum? Will I miss my chance at success? She found herself working past midnight, flour dusting her hair like snow, her hands sore from piping buttercream roses. If her son peeked into the kitchen with sleepy eyes, asking for a bedtime story, she'd wave him off with a promise to join him soon, only to be lured back by the half-finished tears waiting on the counter. One morning, Layla woke with an ache in her back and an even deeper ache in her heart. She recognized that all too familiar exhaustion tugging at her, the same feeling she used to numb with medications. Determined not to fall into that spiral, she opened her recovery journal. On a fresh page, she wrote, I feel the rush of panic when I think about turning down work, but I know I have to make room for rest. She called her sister, who listened kindly and reminded Layla of her progress. You've already come so far, her sister said. Overworking won't help you hold on to success, it'll rob you of the life you've built. Buoyed by these words, Layla made a hard choice. She limited the number of orders she'd accept each week. She informed her growing clientele that her cakes might require a longer wait list. While a few people grumbled, most respected her honesty. To her relief, business didn't collapse. Clients were patient because they valued her craft. More importantly, her mind stopped buzzing at 2 a.m. with dread. She could tuck her son in at night, read him that story, and then go to bed with a heart at peace rather than in a panic. The old patterns were still there, lurking, but this time she faced them head on with boundaries and self awareness. Desmond struggled with burnout. Desmond was 45 and worked as a high school math teacher in a bustling city. He was the kind of educator who stayed late to help struggling students, hoping to provide the stable guidance he lacked growing up. For years, his life's mission was to ensure no young person felt invisible in his classroom. Yet this dedication came at a price. Desmond found himself at school well before dawn, preparing lesson plans, grading endless stacks of papers, and volunteering for every committee. He'd stopped going to the gym, rarely made time to see friends, and subsisted mostly on microwaved meals eaten while hunched over his laptop. He had once engaged in compulsive behaviors like excessive gaming to cope with his childhood traumas. Eventually, he'd sought help through a support group for process addictions. There, he learned healthier ways to manage anxiety and stress. For a while, he was diligent in practicing self-care, but over the past few months, he let those routines slip. The demands of the school year and a never-ending desire to do more left him running on fumes. When midterms arrived, Desmond started experiencing severe headaches. At first, he shrugged them off, telling himself that every teacher felt stressed during exam season. But the headaches grew worse, accompanied by waves of dizziness. One morning, he nearly fainted in front of his homeroom class. A sympathetic student guided him to a chair, and the embarrassment on Desmond's face was as telling as his trembling limbs. Later that evening, he lay on his sofa, blinking back tears. He felt like a failure for not being able to shoulder the load. The next day, he reluctantly visited a doctor, who confirmed that he was burned out. His body was demanding a rest he had consistently denied it. Desmond took a few days off, though it felt agonizing to relinquish control over his classes. In the stillness of his apartment, he wrestled with guilt. But slowly, he began remembering the support group principles he'd once embraced, acknowledging limits, leaning on others for help, and practicing small acts of self-kindness. He spoke to his principal about reducing after-school commitments and arranged for a teaching assistant to help with grading. He revisited the techniques he'd learned in therapy, breathwork, daily journaling, short meditations in the morning. At first, it was an uphill battle to break his habit of endless productivity. Yet each time he paused, Desmond felt a flicker of relief in his chest, a softening of the weight he'd been carrying. Now, instead of staying late every day, he leaves the school building at a reasonable hour, allowing himself a quiet evening to decompress. His headaches have started to subside, and while he still feels pangs of guilt at times, he's learning that true dedication can coexist with self-preservation. Without rest, he can't be the teacher or the person he aspires to be. Reflections on rest. In these three journeys, Caroline's gentle retreat into the hush of the coastline, Desmond's reluctant confrontation with burnout, and Leela's steadfast refusal to let old patterns consume her, we see how rest becomes not merely a break, but a profound act of healing. Recovery, whether from substances, trauma, or addictive behaviors, demands courage, and part of that courage is learning when to slow down. Rest doesn't signify laziness or a lack of ambition. It's the unspoken promise we make to ourselves that we matter beyond our productivity. In each of these stories, healing begins the moment they choose to honor stillness. Whether it's through a stolen weekend by the sea, a much needed medical leave, or a deliberate capping of orders, rest carves out space for reflection, rejuvenation, and self compassion. And as these individuals discover, that space is where true transformation takes root, where they learn they don't have to outrun their pain, but can instead find the grace to be at peace with themselves, flaws and all,